I'd like to introduce a special a guest today, Eric Kaldal. He's the president, CEO, and chief curator for the Amerind Foundation, which is located about 15 miles east of Benson, Arizona. Uh, Eric is an archaeologist and a 2000 graduate of the University of Arizona. So he's going to tell us all about the Amerind Foundation. There's a lot to tell. So welcome to Eric.
Thank you so much for having me. Welcome to everyone. I'm glad to be with you this afternoon. Before I get started, I did just want to acknowledge that the Amerind Foundation is located in southeastern Arizona. And in southeastern Arizona, the lands here have been the home of O'odham, Apache, Hopi, and Oshawott people for untold generations. People whose culture are vibrant and alive and still teaching us wisdom and lessons to this day. And we very much appreciate all that they have to share with us through our museum and through our programs. I want to say that Amerind's mission is to advance an understanding of the indigenous peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. I did want to let you know about a couple of upcoming programs that just given your list of past programs sounded like something you might want to attend. This coming Friday, April 30th, at the University of Arizona, in conjunction with the Amerind Foundation, there's a division of the University of Arizona called the Southwest Center, and you can find them at, if you look at the bar up here at the top, swc.arizona.edu. And this Friday, they're going to be holding a panel discussion called The Border and Its Bodies. One of the things that Amerind does is we act as a convening space, a think tank, where people of various disciplines gather to work out books together. And this book was created during one of those sessions at Amerind. It focuses specifically on the experiences of the US-Mexico border and border crossers experience on their bodies, on their health, on their state of well-being. They're going to be holding that at the Southwest Center in conjunction with the Amerind this Friday, April 30th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. So if you'd like to join them, you would navigate to their website and register to take part in that via Zoom. For the Amerind Foundation specifically, our next program that we're doing as a webinar, and our webinars are generally held on Saturday mornings at 11 a.m. Our next one is going to be held on May the 8th. It's called The Art of Water in the Southwest, Parched. Parched was an interesting traveling exhibit. It was not put together by the Amerind, but was put together by the Flagstaff Arts Council. And in this traveling exhibit, 9 different artists, several from indigenous communities, collaborated with scientists who study water and water purity issues to put together, to first immerse the artists in the science of water on the Colorado Plateau, the contamination from uranium mines, the scarcity of water that we're facing in the Southwest. And then these artists went forth and created an exhibit together, and that joint show is now on exhibit at Amerind. What's going to happen on May the 8th is at 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock, there's a 1-hour documentary film that all the artists and scientists collaborated on, and we're going to show that film via Zoom. And then from 11 to noon, a select series of the scientists and artists involved in the program are going to be presenting about their work. So the Amerind Foundation is an old private nonprofit institution here in Southern Arizona. We were founded back in 1937, and if you haven't visited before, this is a shot of our campus. The Amerind is home to 1,900 acres of desert grassland. We're about just shy of 5,000 feet of elevation, so we do get snow up here pretty regularly in our wintertime season. And you're looking down at our buildings on our main campus. If you want to visit us and haven't visited us before, from Green Valley, from Green Valley, depending on where you depart from, it's about a 1-hour drive, 1-hour, 15-minute drive. You would need to go down Rita Road or follow the interstate. Once you join Interstate 10, you would drive out to exit number 318, which is the Dragoon Road exit. And we are located just 1 mile off the interstate between the modern towns of Benson and Wilcox. We're located in a formation called Texas Canyon, which you'll see signs for it as you come in. It's these amazing geologic formations. It's the remains of a pluton that formed about 50 million years ago. And gradually rose to the surface of the earth and is eroding these fantastic boulder formations. If you've ever stopped at the rest area in Texas Canyon, it's one of the most stopped at rest areas along Interstate 10. You're surrounded by those beautiful boulders, and that's actually the northern portion of our land. As you look south from Amerind, you see the Dragoon Mountains, where Cochise had his stronghold. The Amerind was founded by two well-off individuals from back east. They were born in Waterbury, Connecticut. Mr. William Shirley Fulton was born in 1880, and his wife, Rose Hayden, was born in 1881, just a few months apart. So they knew each other as children. They were coming from very old New England families whose roots go back before the Revolutionary War. At the time, these two were coming of age. Mrs. Fulton's family's wealth was in copper mines in the state of Arizona, and Mr. Fulton's family's wealth was owning factories that made brass on the East Coast. And you see them just as about they're departing on their honeymoon trip in 1906 in the left-hand picture, and we still have that camera in the collection today. And on the right, you see them celebrating their 50th anniversary at the Amerind Foundation, and more about how they got here to the Amerind in just a bit. If you've ever visited the Arizona Inn in Tucson, had lunch there, walked their grounds, the architect who designed the Arizona Inn, his name was Merritt Howard Starkweather, also designed all of the Amerind Foundation buildings. In the upper left of this picture is the home that belonged to the Fultons. They built it in 1930, and in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a picture of their courtyard. And if you ever get a chance to visit here, and we're doing one of our tours of this house, we do them once a month during our high season. You'll see a lot of the details that you see in the Arizona Inn throughout the architecture. They also hired him to build their museum. I should say Mr. and Mrs. Fulton had a long-term interest in Native American arts and crafts. And even when they were back in New England, before they ever imagined moving out to the state of Arizona, they were already collecting Native American arts and crafts from the Eastern Seaboard and from the indigenous peoples of New England. So by the time they moved to Arizona, and that's in the year 1930, when they moved to Arizona in the year 1930, Mr. Fulton already has a collection of several thousand objects. And if you read the correspondence between he and his wife is eager to get that material out of the house. So he starts to build a museum, and that's the building you see on the lower left-hand side. The museum was built in stages between the year 1936 and 1954. And then the last building we built in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a large building on the right-hand side. That photo is a little bit dated. We now have a handicapped accessible lift that's on the front of this building. This is our art gallery building, built in 1958. It also houses our research library. So what possessed them to come out here and buy up a piece of land and build their own center? Well, Mr. Fulton and Mrs. Fulton, as I said, had always had an interest in Native American arts and crafts. If we look back at their correspondence as a young couple, the local museum there, they were patrons of it, and they were particularly interested in patronizing the Native American arts section of that local museum. Mrs. Fulton's father, the one with the mining interest in the state of Arizona, after they were married, asked his new son-in-law, Mr. Fulton, if he would come out to the American West and work in the family mining operation. I'm not sure why he agreed to that, because Mr. Fulton had his own family business in the brass making factories, but for a few years he went to work for his father-in-law. He came to the state of Arizona and fell in love with the place. He visited the Navajo Nation communities, he visited the Hopi villages, he traveled around the Colorado Plateau. He became friends with one of the most famous archaeologists ever to grace the American Southwest in the 20th century, Dr. Emil Howry. Dr. Howry has a whole building named after him on the University of Arizona campus for good reason. Those two struck up a friendship, and Mr. Fulton got a passion for archaeology. So why build his own center? Well, there were already a couple models, I have to say. There were already a couple models for research centers in the American Southwest. At the time Mr. Fulton was thinking of moving here, there was a wealthy family from back east, the Colton family, who built their own museum and research center in Flagstaff. That's the Museum of Northern Arizona today. There was also another wealthy family from back east who had built their own archaeological research center in Globe, Arizona, in the middle portion of our state, the Gladwin family. Those were both founded in the 1920s. So, and Mr. Fulton has a lively correspondence with both of those founding families. And so he gets a bug that when he turns 50, and he's going to turn 50 in the year 1930, he's going to retire out west. He's going to build what for them will be their third home, and he's going to have his own research center. So the northern portion of the state is taken by the Coltons. The middle portion of the state is taken by the Gladwin family. So he looks here to the south. It's also the case that his teenage son attends a boarding school in Tucson for his last years of high school. So Mr. Fulton is riding the railroads back and forth to Tucson to see his older child. And he stops in Dragoon, which used to be a railroad stop. It isn't anymore. And he fell in love with Texas Canyon and decided that here he would build. So he bought up 3 square miles of land from the local homesteaders who had their origins in Texas, hence the name Texas Canyon. And he decides to build his own research center. Now, the Amerind Foundation property has over 20 archaeological sites on it. And when he buys the property in 1930 and he and his wife start to come here, he does his own amateur excavations. And as he gets older into his 50s, I think he decides he would like younger backs to do the work. So in 1937, he incorporates the Amerind as a private research foundation with a mission of expanding our understanding of the native peoples of the Americas. And from that point forward, he starts construction of his museum, and he also bankrolls archaeological projects, but he hires young professionally trained archaeologists to do the work. So you see in the middle of this map, the Amerind Foundation is a little dot in brown, and all the red dots that you see on the map are archaeological sites that the Amerind excavated in the 1930s and 1940s under the supervision of Mr. Fulton and his first archaeologist. One of the first excavations that he conducts after making us a private research center is a site called the Gleason site. And if you look at your map, you'll see a little town called Gleason. The site is quite close to that town. It's a site where there is naturally occurring turquoise, and the people there were making turquoise jewelry that gets traded for hundreds of miles across the Southwest. The people who lived there belonged to the Hohokam archaeological tradition. They were farming peoples, and they flourished in the area between 8900 and 1100. What you see in the top photo here is the remains of an Amerind excavation. The dark holes that you see in the ground, those are the holes that held posts that helped support the roof of this home. It's a rectangular home in outline. And the 2 large circles that you see, the dark spots, those were pits that supported major roof beams, that supported a cross brace, that supported the roof of this structure. While he was digging at the Gleason site, he uncovered the pot that you see on the lower left-hand corner. That pot would have been painted 1,000 years ago. And Mr. Fulton was so taken with the design, he made it the logo of the foundation. Here you see that pot again with other pots of the area. So the Hohokam area, for those of you who are perhaps visited some of our national parks or read some of our books on the archaeology of the Southwest, the Hohokam archaeological region takes up much of the deserts of Arizona, from Phoenix all the way down to the international border, from over where today's New Mexico state line are, all the way over to the Colorado River. In Phoenix, they're particularly well known as incredible engineers. The Hohokam people there dug some 2,000 kilometers of irrigation channel to bring water to their gardens and their crops. Down in the Tucson area, there were perhaps 10,000 Hohokam farmers. Up in the Phoenix area, there were 40 to 60,000 Hohokam farmers. And out where the Amerind is, in what is today Cochise County, between Benson and Wilcox, out where the Amerind is, the San Pedro Valley is our river, and it was probably home to 3,000 or 4,000 Hohokam farmers. All across the region, they make this beautiful red painted pottery on a brown colored background. Up in Phoenix, it's a lighter buff colored clay. And here in southeastern Arizona, where the Amerind's located, all the archaeological sites, the potters here just love star designs. And you see a 4-pointed, a 5-pointed, and a 6-pointed star, as that was a favorite motif in their artwork. Well, after Mr. Fulton was through excavating sites around southern Arizona, he hired a young gentleman, and he's shown in this picture on the left. His name was Charles DePeso, and he went by Charlie as far as Mr. Fulton was concerned. Charlie DePeso was not Mr. Fulton's first archaeologist, but he was his last archaeologist. Charlie was born in 1920, so he's 40 years Mr. Fulton's junior. And Charlie finished his degree at the University of Arizona and came to work for Mr. Fulton. Mr. Fulton actually was looking for a promising young student, and he reached out to his friend, Dr. Howery, who I mentioned earlier, and said, do you have a promising young student who would be a great leader of my archaeological team at Amerind? And Dr. Howery said, there's this young fellow named Charlie. He would be available much quicker if somebody helped fund his dissertation research. Mr. Fulton got that message and he wrote a check, and he basically underwrote the rest of Charlie DePeso's graduate career with the understanding that he would come to work for Mr. Fulton after his studies were complete. Well, when Charlie joined the staff in 1948, first as an archaeologist, and then by 1952, Mr. Fulton was so taken with his work and with his vision and with his creativity that Charlie went on to lead and decide the research direction of the Amerind from 1952 until Charlie passed away in 1984. Excuse me. That date on our screen, 1982 is correct, yes. So a little more about Charlie, because he's really important to the Amerind story. That's the upper right-hand picture is Charlie with his young family. That's his wife, Fran. She was his constant companion and co-worker in the archaeological projects Charlie undertook. And those are their two boys, Corey and David. Charlie was a big thinker, and he worked at this private research institute where Mr. Fulton could basically bankroll whatever was in Charlie's imagination. And Charlie was really interested in the big collisions of ethnically diverse people in history. And that really defined where his research agenda went. Over the course of career, he was a marathon performer in the field with archaeological project after archaeological project after archaeological project. Everything he did, he published very faithfully and very quickly. He was a peculiar figure. I will say that many of Charlie's ideas are not mainstream in the archaeological community of today, but he was a meticulous analyst. And even though some of his interpretations haven't stood the test of time, people still look to Charlie's publications for the information contained in them. And we still get researchers visiting the Amerind archives just to look at his studies. One of his really important colleagues was Gloria Fenner. She was a young woman that Charlie hired in the 1960s, and they are standing in the middle of our collections repository. The Amerind is home to a 40,000 piece archaeological and cultural collection and fine art collection. And you get a sense of that scale in that photograph with Charlie and Gloria standing together in the repository. So what do I mean by big collisions of history? So one of Charlie's earliest projects in the 1950s. So the site, there's an old black and white photograph you're seeing on the upper right-hand corner of your screen. That little trickle of water that you see in the screen is the San Pedro River. And you see a high hill above that river. Now, this place that I'm showing you in the photograph is a very short drive from the Amerind, and it's just really about 15 minutes north of the city of Benson. It is squarely in what we would consider Hohokam country, Hohokam archaeological country. There would be Hohokam villages all over the place, starting all the way back around AD 800 and continuing all the way to almost AD 1400. So many centuries of Hohokam people living here. Well, in 700 years ago, up in the northern portions of the American Southwest, there was a great drought. And that great drought caused a lot of people to start to move. That happened between the years 1276 and 1299. If you've ever visited Mesa Verde, they talk about the abandonment of Mesa Verde. Mesa Verde is a much bigger area, as archaeologists talk about it, than just the national park. It's the whole region, really, of southwestern Utah and southeastern Colorado. When the great drought struck, it's estimated that 10,000 people who were living in that area of southeastern Utah, southwestern Colorado, started to move away from Mesa Verde and move southward, and this set up an effect of more and more and more people looking for areas that were better watered where they could grow their crops. That brings me back to this picture. So there's some people from the Colorado Plateau, probably maybe 6 or 8 families, 60 or 70 people, who traveled on foot for about 200 miles from the north to the south to set up a new home on this little ridgetop in what was Hohokam country. So they were migrants to the area. They were probably speaking a different language. They certainly had a different architectural style, where Hohokam folks built out of wood and earth and adobe. The folks from the Colorado Plateau built out of stone and wood homes. And if you were to visit this ridge top, you would see alignments of stones from their ancient homes. They also brought their pottery tradition with them. If you remember the picture I showed earlier of Hohokam pots with that red paint on that brown colored pottery, this is the pottery that came down with these folks from the north. So they look completely different. They're making things completely differently. They were settling down in a new area. And ultimately they, I'm sure young men meet young women, young men meet young men, young women meet young women, and new households are set up. And eventually they become part of the local Hohokam population. But they do bring some other ideas with them. If you visited some of the sites in the Colorado Plateau area, such as Mesa Verde, such as Chaco Canyon, such as Canyon de Chelly, you know that the folks up in the north built these underground chambers that, if you visit a National Park Service site, will be labeled with the Hopi word kiva. It's an underground space where important ceremonies are held, and these are still used by Pueblo people today and constructed by Pueblo people today. And they built one of these ceremonial structures right there north of Benson, way, 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 way far away from their homeland, to bring their religion and their ideology with them. They also brought other parts of their technology. They have this beautiful black paint. That black paint is made from a particular plant called Rocky Mountain beeweed. When Charlie was excavating these rooms, he did recover pollen samples, and Rocky Mountain beeweed was actually brought down with these migrants and planted near their community so that they would have the resource to make that black paint locally. It's not used by any of the Hohokam folks. So Charlie was interested in documenting this experience of migration and what it meant year over year and generation over generation, 7 centuries ago. Another collision of cultures Charlie investigated was a Spanish presidio. This is a Spanish presidio that is in the San Pedro River Valley. It's near a little town that you can visit today called Fairbank, which is an abandoned town, but the Bureau of Land Management owns it, and it's open to the public for hiking. There is a presidio called Santa Cruz de Terrenate, and it was founded at the same time that the presidio of Tucson was founded, 1775, 1776, also by the gentleman from the Spanish military, Hugo O'Connor, who is responsible for the founding of Tucson. Again, Charlie was interested in these big collisions. How did Native people and the Spanish interact when they came together? He not only excavated inside the fort, and if you look at the lower left-hand black and white photo, you see an aerial view and you see something that looks like a rectangular structure in the formations of the earth that you see there. That rectangular structure is the walls of the fort. These are some of the officers' barracks that he excavated, but he also excavated around the fort. And excavated Native communities nearby that were contemporary to explore that intersection of culture. But by far and away, the excavation that Charlie DePeso and the Amerind Foundation generally are most famous for is the Joint Casas Grandes project. That project was held between 1958 and 1961, and it was held in the state of Chihuahua in northern Mexico. And if you look at the lower inset map, there's a pink square on the map. That is the general region where Paquime is located. So there's a modern town called Casas Grandes there, not to be confused with Casa Grande in Arizona, Casas Grandes in the plural. And there's a ruin there that you're seeing on your screen, an aerial photograph of, called Paquime. Paquime is one of the most important and intriguing sites in the American Southwest. It's certainly on par with a place like Chaco Canyon. And the funny story about how Amerind went about excavating it. So Charlie DePeso had been doing project after project after project for the Amerind, and he published and he published and he published. And Mr. Fulton came to him and said, "Hey, what's next? What's the Amerind going to tackle next, Charlie?" And Charlie was kind of tired, according to family lore. And Charlie pitched to him, what if we went to Chihuahua and worked with the Mexican government to excavate this huge 3,000 room archaeological site? What do you think about that? Charlie was actually hoping that Mr. Fulton would say no, according to family lore. And instead, Mr. Fulton said, well, sure, let's do that. So Charlie got in touch with the Mexican government, because archaeological projects in Mexico always must be conducted jointly with Mexico's federal national agency, the Institute of Anthropology and History. and conceived the Joint Casas Grandes project. And Mr. Fulton bankrolled it to the tune of a couple $100,000 in 1958. What did they find there? They found this amazingly complex city. Like I said, 2,000 to 3,000 rooms. Parts of the place were probably 3 and 4 stories tall. The walls were built out of incredibly thick rammed earth. They sit at an elevation that's 3,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level. They're near the Rio Casas Grandes, which provided them the farmland they needed to support that population. And it was a town that flourished 7 centuries ago. They built this amazing town with all these amazing features. There was a freshwater spring that's produced several thousand gallons of water. They constructed an aqueduct over the course of about 2.5 miles from that spring to the town to bring fresh water into the community. They built these beautiful, really distinctive pottery. If any of you are fond of the modern pottery made by the villagers of Mata Ortiz potters originally took their inspiration, because they're just about 20 miles from Paquimé. The village of Mata Ortiz potters took their inspiration from ancient Paquimean pottery that preceded them by 7 centuries. They were also raising these amazing birds. There were 3 different species of birds that they were raising at the site. Charlie is shown here working on a scarlet macaw cage. There were several hundred macaws that were found respectfully buried in this town. They consisted of scarlet macaws. Scarlet macaws do not occur naturally in northern Mexico. Their native territory is in the tropics, so they had to be brought to that location. They were also raising military macaws, a bright green bird that occurred naturally in the mountains above Paquimé. And they were also raising turkeys, but there are no butcher marks on the bones of those turkeys. What did they want with all of them? They probably wanted their feathers. Feathers are a really important accoutrement to clothing and to prayer and to ritual that we know from the native peoples of northern Mexico and the American Southwest to this day. And I'm sure they were very important. So Mr. Fulton, the Paquimé project was really the last project of his lifetime that he supported directly. Mr. Fulton passed away in 1964, and his wife, Mrs. Fulton, passed away in 1968. Charlie continued to lead the Amerind in its research agenda. We went on to conduct an excavation in southern New Mexico at a Mimbres archaeological site. And then Charlie passed away far too young from cancer in 1982. At that point in time, we had this amazing museum building, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But during all the time through Charlie's lifetime, our museum was actually not open to the public. You had to call for an appointment to visit it. And it was after 1982, under the administration of Dr. Ann Woosley, that we opened our museum to the public. Our last field project that we supported was in the year 1990. And from that point forward, Dr. Woosley had an amazing idea that we would support the synthesis of research rather than field work with Amerind's resources. It continues to be our mission to advance an understanding of the native peoples of the Americas. But what we do, and all the people that you see in these pictures, are historians, community elders from various indigenous communities, scholars with a lot of knowledge keepers who come to our campus. They have a retreat here in our facility, and they are charged with producing a book that summarizes their research together. So we produce at least 1 to 2 books a year through the University of Arizona Press. When these people gather here, they sit in our library. That's the central picture. We do have a 20,000 volume research library here at the Amerind. We're actually, during COVID, we actually had to suspend all of our programs because people couldn't gather in person. And we're so excited that the vaccination of many of our scholars is continuing, and our next group of scholars will be able to convene here in May. We also have this beautiful museum building. So Mr. and Mrs. Fulton were collecting Native American arts and crafts that were contemporary with them. So they were born in the late 19th century and lived most of their lives in the 20th. And we also had all of this archaeological materials to share with people through our exhibitions. Our museum has 8,000 square feet of gallery space. If you'd like to visit us, we're open 6 days a week, Tuesday through Sunday. We're just closed on Mondays and on major holidays, and we're open from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Things that you'll see when you get here, you'll see um, an amazing array of beautiful visionary objects created by Native peoples in many different times and places. The object you see on your left was painted by an artist 1,000 years ago. The item you see on your right was painted by an artist 60 years ago. We have a wonderful exhibit about the ancient town of Paquimé and the region of Casas Grandes. It starts on the basis of Amerind's research there back in the years 1958 to 1961. But I was fortunate to be joined by 8 archaeologists from both sides of what is today the international border, who helped advise me in an 80th anniversary celebration exhibit, where we updated people on the research that has occurred since Charlie and Eduardo Contreras from the Mexican government excavated there so many years ago. And that collection continues to be inspirational. You see a pot that was created 7 centuries ago there, and another one on the right. We had a visiting artist, Rosemary Lone Wolf, and she actually created, she's a ceramic artist as well as, this is one of her prints, and she actually created a new series of tiles that drew her inspiration from the aesthetic of Casas Grandes. The Fuldens also amassed a fine art collection of several hundred pieces. Because they came from the East Coast, we do have an interesting representation of East Coast artists, mainly National Academy of Design artists. We have a Hudson River School piece by George Innes Sr., as well as his son, George Innes Jr. Other National Academy artists like Roy Mason, Jonas Lee, and others. That doesn't come out very often. Now and again, I'll say, well, let's do an exhibit of Mr. and Mrs. Fulden's East Coast art, but we don't have that up right now. Once they moved to the American West, Mr. and Mrs. Fulden started buying Western artists, Remington, William R. Lee, Olaf Weghorst, and they also started to buy very early on important indigenous artists like Hopi artist Fred Caboti and Peter Sheldon, whose work you see here on screen, the Dene artist Harrison Begay and Andras Nigeny. And R.C. Gorman, if you're familiar with R.C. Gorman's work, you'll say the one on the left doesn't look anything like an R.C. Gorman. That's because this is a work he created when he was a student studying art in Mexico City. And that distinctive R.C. Gorman style was still in his future. And on the right, a piece by Alan Hauser, who's usually most famous for his sculptures. I think we've all seen and admired them on places like the Heard Museum, the National Museum of the American Indian, the Getty. This is some paintings of his that we have here in the Amerind collection. We used to have, until COVID, an active schedule of students coming to visit us. Unfortunately, COVID put the stop to that. But we were very fortunate recently to win a grant, a federal grant from an organization called the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And right now we're working with Native elders and other knowledge keepers, other historians, to put together a series of 30 classroom lessons that focus on Indigenous history and culture that we can provide on the web to teachers in their classrooms across Southern Arizona. We have an active series of loan programs. Before I joined the Amerind Foundation, I was an employee of the Tohono Nation, one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, working on the construction of their museum located in Topawa, Arizona. And there's a delegation of Tohono elders coming to visit the Amerind collection from different Native tribes. We've loaned things to the Navajo Nation Museum, the Tohono Museum, and we're always so privileged and happy to have these knowledge keepers advise us on our exhibitions and our programs. We have some really rare and special things in our collection. Mr. Fulden was really interested in collecting hemispherically at first. Today, we've narrowed our scope of collection of arts and crafts to really trying to focus on northern Mexico and the American Southwest. But this hat that you see in the upper right-hand corner has a special story. It was woven 2 centuries ago. That's spruce root that the hat is woven from, and belongs to the Alutiiq people. And the long things that look like sticks that you see bound to that hat, you see them in the photograph here, those are sea lion whiskers. Hunter out on the water would wear this to keep the sun off of the hunter's head. And the sea lion whiskers document that hunter's success in bringing in sea lions and other sea mammals to the community. These beautiful beads that you see here are actually trade beads from Russia, because this hat was woven when Alaska was part of the Russian sphere of influence. The Alutiiq people wanted to recreate weaving these hats because it had fallen out of use by the 21st century. And they did a survey. They dispatched their museum folks all over the world to try to find all the hats that they could, and they found Amerind's. And they could only document 31 left on Earth. And we've shared photographs and with folks. I'm proud to say that this tradition of weaving in spruce root has been revived, and hats like this are being made by folks in the northwest coast of Canada and in Alaska once again. This is another one of our really rare treasures. That basket that you see on the lower right-hand corner would have been left here. It was found in a cave, a dry cave, quite near where the Arizona-New Mexico state lines are and quite close to where today's international border is located. It was probably woven by a Chiricahua Apache weaver, and it was left in that cave before the Chiricahua Apache were forcibly removed by the US government in 1886. It's the only basket that I know of that vintage anywhere, and we're very honored that it is located here at the Amerind Museum, where the Chiricahua Apache people can always come and visit it. We were honored when we shared this basket with the community when it was donated here by a local ranching family, to have the Chiricahua Apache tribal historian, Mr. Darrow, come out and speak to us about this basket, and it's always on exhibit for people to see. Every year we do have a major festival in the fall. It's already on our calendar for October this year. Last year we held this event virtually. This year I hope that, vaccinations willing and the public health situation improving, that we'll be able to hold it again in person. Every year we work with one Native nation and we invite their historians, their knowledge keepers to come and offer lectures about, well, any topic they wish that their community wants to share with the public. We invite their performing artists to come. We've had rock bands and we've had Native traditional dances and everything in between. And we invite artists from their community to come and sell directly to the public. So that event holds in October each year. Our grounds are still visited and used by different groups of Indigenous people. The lady in the upper left-hand corner is Lola Thomas. She's a master weaver. We have on the Amerind Foundation property a lot of the raw materials from which baskets can be woven. She's working there with the Goodings willow trees on our campus. She's going to strip that bark down and use it in a willow bark basket. She was also near a pond that has cattails in it, and the foundation for her basket was going to be cattails. And you see her with some other folks on the Tonopah Nation who she was teaching about her basket making and raw material gathering techniques. We do try to have, as I said, we've gone to webinars. We used to have in-campus programs before COVID, although our online programs have really been quite tremendous. Today's program that we had at the Amerind drew over 1,000 viewers. Honestly, when we had programs on our campus, we still value those, but even on our biggest room at maximum capacity, which you could not do in the pandemic, we could hold 80 people. And today our programs are reaching several hundred people each time we hold them. We do try to highlight and hold up Indigenous voices, speaking about issues from art to history, to contemporary issues facing their community throughout the year. We also have speakers who are non-Indigenous, who frequently are working with Indigenous communities on issues of history and archaeology. So that is the history of the Amerind Foundation. I don't want to cut off time for questions, but it really started with a vision of our founders. In the lower left-hand corner, you see Mr. and Mrs. Fulton there, a long and happy marriage, sitting on their porch in Dragoon, holding hands, looking at the camera together. And Mr. Fulton and Mrs. Fulton's vision for building this place to do original research and to create a place whose mission is to help us understand and grow our appreciation of Native American communities and all that they have to teach us and their rich place in the fabric of American life, and inspiring generations that we see in the future to learn from all of us. So I think I'm going to stop there and take any questions that you might have.
We really appreciate it. I do have a question for you from Barbara Dickinson, and because of Barbara, you're here. So we have to give her credit for inviting you.
Thank you, Barbara.
her question is, how do you partner with the native peoples to have the artifacts present at the museum, and is there a collaborative relationship for sharing?
Well, whenever we embark on a new exhibition, I will reach out, or one of our curators and staff will reach out to a knowledge keeper, someone who is well versed in their community, and we'll ask to form a partnership with them. And then, there's an exhibit we have up right now that has a member of the Tohono community, a member of the Choctaw community, a member of the Hopi community. And it's an exhibit that was funded in part by the Arizona Humanities Council. And it's an exhibit that examines running traditions and games in North America, particularly the northern portion of Mexico and the American Southwest. So we invited those folks in and we talked about what our goals are, what we wanted the public to learn about. Then we looked at some of the objects in our collection and we picked some of those objects collaboratively. Then there was a relation, knowing what our advisors want us to talk about and teach about, we would start writing text together and we would share that text back and forth for refinement and revision and improvement with their expert input. And then that would become an exhibition that we put up. An exhibit before that, also funded by the Arizona Humanities, was one of our textiles. I was very fortunate to have a master weaver, Barbara Teller Ornelas from the Diné community. She actually did a heroic effort. We went through every Diné textile that the Amerind Foundation owns with her and cares for, and she gave personal commentaries on each and every piece. And she helped us pick the pieces that would be exhibited and helped us write the story that we would share with the public. So that's how we conduct our process of creating exhibitions.
If anyone has a question, you can either chat or raise your blue hand. Doug Simon has a question.
Yeah, recently we were up in the Northern Arizona Museum in Flagstaff, and it shares many other points of view of history. One thing that I haven't been able to establish with confidence is the reasons for the depopulation. You mentioned drought as being the primary reason. I read also that there was some consideration of the possibility that some celestial convolution of stars or something gave the people a feeling that they needed to move. What do you know about that possibility?
I really couldn't speak to that particular possibility. And I guess I wouldn't say, I did bring up the Great Drought because the depopulation, there is a significant depopulation that happens at the same time as the Great Drought that we have from our dendroclimatic records. But there's entire books. We actually produced a whole book in one of our think tank series called Leaving Mesa Verde. There are whole books about that some would suggest that it's more than simply that people were stressed for food resources or arable land. There was also an inability for people to socially and politically cope with the uncertainty that was surrounding their communities at that time, and that the wiser course of action was to move away. And that led to that wiser course of action being pursued by people all over the community. And I'm certainly not an Indigenous person, but one of the things that you will hear over and over again when Indigenous folks from, say, Hopi or Zuni or Acoma or Laguna talk about their people and their history is that movement is part of the way of life. And we actually have another book about that where we had knowledge keepers from several Native communities and archaeologists and historians come together and point out that, movement is part and parcel to the human story, and that moving is natural to going to a location where a community can be reformed in a newer and better way. So I think the depopulation of Mesa Verde is complex. I don't think we have a full understanding. It certainly does co-occur with a very important climatic period. But but the uncertainty and the decisions that people made may be more than just about waters on fields.
All right, George has a question.
I was curious at Pakame, at what level were their cultures? Did they have the ability to write down their history where it could be stored? Maybe that was in their art, or and if did they have some form of money, or was it all a barter and trade as far as cultural goes?
The Pokemans, to the best of our knowledge, have no writing system. There haven't been any characters discovered. They certainly have a rich palette of artistic motifs that they use over and over and over again. That makes them distinctly unique. There isn't anything that I can think of that we would call money. There are rare and unusual items that come into Pakime and are gathered there in large numbers, which is one of the reasons why we think Pakime is an important location in the American Southwest. For example, so you saw Pakime on the map. It's located at a fairly high elevation. It's close to the Sierra Madre Occidental. It's quite far from an ocean, and yet over 3 million pieces of seashell were brought into that site. There are copper objects. Those are subject to a lot of debate. There were people in communities in Western Mexico who had copper smelting and copper forming technologies. Charlie DePeso at the Amerind argued that so too did Pakime, that there were copper workers there. Other people have said, no, there probably weren't copper workers there. Probably these things are being traded. But they're really rare, difficult items to get your hands on, these copper objects, if you're not living in a copper producing center. And there's several hundred of them that were found in Pakime. So a lot of rare, special things do come into Pakime. A lot of the thought about that is that the people who were leaders at Pakime were taking these things in as tributes, as a way of connecting them to a larger community across the region, because those seashells come from the West Coast, which would be a trek over the mountains. They also come from the Gulf of Mexico coast. So there's a broad spectrum of connection there.
Well, I read that when I was down there that they had different levels of status within their community, and those that were more rich had more valuable items they were, and if that be the case, how would they bartered and traded for their birds? Would that be the turquoise?
Well, actually, fun fact, we have another book coming out in a year. It should be published. So there's a group of researchers right now, and they had a seminar here at the Amerind, and they were looking at scarlet macaws. And you know, scarlet macaws have a really deep history. And if you visited Chaco Canyon, which is a place that flourished between AD 900 and 1100, so it predates Casas Grandes and Pakime, they had scarlet macaws. If you visited Wopatki near Flagstaff, they had scarlet macaws. If you visited southwestern New Mexico and the Mimbres sites, if you visit Silver City and western New Mexico State's beautiful museum there, there were scarlet macaws found in New Mexico too. And this group of researchers right now is analyzing the DNA from birds around the Southwest. And one of their interesting concluding findings is that these birds are different enough genetically from the wild populations in tropical Mexico that they are suggesting, there's always more research to be done, but they're suggesting that very early, perhaps all the way back in Mimbres times, 1,000 years ago, that people had taken a population of scarlet macaws and were raising them in captivity somewhere in the American Southwest. And Pakime, with several hundred birds, to its credit, would look like a place where that might have been done. You know, it takes a lot of specialized knowledge to raise those birds and keep them healthy and well. Not a macaw raiser. You know, one of the fun things about the macaw book that we worked on was we invited in biologists of scarlet macaws, knowledge keepers from indigenous communities about scarlet macaws, and people who raise and breed them today. And one of the things they said is, this is not an easy task. You have to have a lot of knowledge to do this successfully. And maybe Pakime was a place where people could do that, and they had brought the specialists together to do that there.
I have a couple of chat questions for Eric. One is, what are your sources of funding? I don't think you touched on that. Could you address that?
Our funding comes in three parts. So a very important part is what we call our earned income. So that's our admissions at our front desk, our museum store sales, that beautiful Fulton family home, our members can rent it out for special events. Those are things that bring in about a third of our income. The other third of our income comes from charitable contributions in the community, donors and members. Without them, we really couldn't do the work that we do. And the last third of our income, Mr. and Mrs. Fulton were quite visionary. They left us with a portfolio of investments, and all credit to Amerind's Board of Trustees. Decade over decade, they have carefully husbanded that resource. And they allow us to take a small percentage of that corpus of investments each year to support our operations, and that's the other third.
Okay. Another question from Carolyn Dean. Does the Amerind sponsor any traveling exhibits?
Not right now. We're working on that for our jewelry exhibit, which I didn't talk about because I filled up most of the time. One of the most interesting, profoundly moving donations we've received in the last decade in my time at the Amerind. There is one family that for 4 generations now lived in Zuni, New Mexico. The founders of that family originally came as missionaries in the 1890s, and many generations of the family, there are still family members who live there. And they got in the business of operating trading posts. And from the very first generation, they made a point of setting aside the jewelry that those trading posts were trading in. So they amassed a collection, Zuni and Navajo jewelry, 10,000 pieces big, with 100 years of business records, and donated it to the Amerind. So we have this remarkable exhibit up where, because of those business records, we know things like who made it and when were styles popular, and who were the artists, and what were they working in, and what were their inspirations. And we are working right now on trying to turn that into a traveling exhibit that we can share more broadly. The family members who donated the collection to us have a vision of us sharing that collection nationally and internationally, and we're working very hard to sponsor our first traveling exhibit focused around that remarkable jewelry collection and its history.
So for those people interested in archaeology, I don't know how you can answer this. Maybe there is no answer, but let's say you're going to go on an archaeological dig somewhere and something major. How long might you spend there?
Oh goodness, there are a lot of different programs. The U.S. Forest Service has a wonderful program called the Passports in Time program. They've done work in the Santa Ritas, restoring some of the historic ranches and farmsteads in the Santa Ritas. They've also taken volunteers to survey archaeological sites and work with Forest Service archaeologists to protect sites. The Arizona State Historic Preservation Office and State Park System has a program called the Site Stewards Program, where they invite volunteers in the community to help safeguard and watch over our archaeological resources in the state. There are people who travel abroad to work on excavations in places like the Near East. Some of the volunteers here at Amerind have taken part in those. Those are obviously at your own expense. And there are some universities and colleges that welcome volunteers to pay their way to come out and work on sites around the world. So it can be for a few days, it could be weeks or months, depending on what you're looking for.
Right. Well, the one you talked about in Mexico was an amazing one. How long did it take for that to all be uncovered and revealed?
Well, the Amerind only dug 1/3 of the site.
Mm.
The project lasted from 1958 to 1961. And then the analysis of the collection continued because there were millions of things. And it resulted in an 8-volume publication that came out in 1974 to give you a sense of the scope and scale of what it took to get that collection published.
Can you come
Just
on?
wondering, you You pointed out a number of sites on the map where archaeological digs have been done around the Amerind Museum. I was just wondering, is that part of what is available to actually tour those sites?
You know, the only, well, I'm thinking. You know, the site that's best available for the public to view that the Amerind excavated is the Spanish Presidio, Santa Cruz de Terrenate. Today, it's part of the San Pedro National Riparian Corridor. And the Bureau of Land Management has done an excellent job of putting in an interpretive trail and signage. That would be the best of all the sites to go see if you wanted to learn more about those places.
And where is that located?
You would need to drive to Benson, Arizona, and then you would drive southward. You have a couple highways to choose from. And then there are highways that run north-south, and then there's a few that run east-west. If you come down towards Tombstone, Arizona, there's an east-west highway that goes across, and that's the place where you would access the road into Terrenate. It's not something you want to do in the summer. It's not there. There's not a lot of shade out there. The parking lot, I want to say it's almost a mile from where the interpretation of the Spanish ruins is located. So don't try to do that in summer. Do that in the winter months. And if you want to learn more about all the archaeological sites, there are other archaeological sites on the San Pedro Riparian Corridor. If you go down to Sierra Vista, Arizona, and you take one of those east-west highways, like you're going to Bisbee, there is a place called San Pedro House, and that is the visitor center for the entire San Pedro Riparian Corridor. They have wonderful birding trips and maps and information and guides and resources to all the archaeological sites that are open to the public that the Bureau of Land Management has put interpretive trails on for the San Pedro corridor.
Another message for you, Eric. This has been a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for taking time to educate us. And
Thank you for having me.
I have a feeling you have much more information inside you to tell us about. Oh, I have one quick question. When Mesa Verde was abandoned, was it about 1200 or something like that?
Late in the 1200s, yes.
And did any of those people end up in Taos, or do you know, or was it along the Rio Grande? Or
Unquestionably, the people who left Mesa Verde went in many different places, but clearly part of the communities they established, many of their descendants are on the Rio Grande, around Taos, around Santa Fe, around Albuquerque, yes.
if people haven't been to Mesa Verde, they need to go see that too.
It's an amazing place. And if you ever get a chance to go to Paquime, it is on the United Nations World Heritage Site list for UNESCO. And there are organized tours. Obviously in COVID, we haven't seen much, but there are tour operators who take regular tours down to Paquime. It's worth a trip going on that organized tour. They usually combine it with visit Paquime, visit that world-class museum that Mexico built there, and see all the amazing things from that town. And then also make a trip over to the Mater Ortiz village that is home to over 600 current contemporary potters for a wonderful experience, seeing some modern creativity at work.
And getting to there, how would anyone find that place?
I would if you still use a tour operator, or I would approach them about when the next tours are going down. They should have their information at their fingertips about who's going down.
Well, Eric, it was a great presentation. We want to thank you, and we want to urge everybody to go down and visit your location. I know I did. I'd go back a second time. So thank you for your presentation. And once again,